$50,000 can sit in a man's pocket like a stone. It does not rattle, it does not shine, it just pulls the world toward it, quietly, the way a drain pulls water. In Harlem, that number did not sound like money. It sounded like permission. Permission for a stranger to step off a bus with a clean coat and a hard heart. Permission for a man to look at another man's life and decide it was small enough to fold and put away. Harlem that winter carried its own weather. Cold sidewalks that turned your ankles stiff. Steam rising from grates like breath from the ground. Shoeshine boys working fast, their rags snapping like small flags. Waitresses moving between tables with tired grace, balancing plates and secrets. Church mothers in thick coats, watching corners the way they watched children, not because they loved danger, but because they knew it lived close. Jazz leaking out of basement rooms in thin ribbons, a trumpet note wandering up the stairs like it was looking for someone. And in the middle of all that, there was Bumpy Johnson, walking like he had all the time in the world, even when the world was trying to shorten his days. He never looked rushed. That was the first thing people noticed and the last thing they understood. Men who wanted power usually wore it loud. They threw it across a room like a chair just to hear it hit. Bumpy did not do that. He wore power the way a man wears a winter coat, because he needs it, because he has earned it, because it keeps him steady. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered faces. He remembered mothers' names. He remembered which kid on which block had a limp and which old man on which stoop did not like strangers. He was not loved the way saints are loved. He was respected the way storms are respected. You do not have to like a storm to know you should not stand in its path. The word moved first through the back rooms, then through the kitchens, then through the mouths of men who tried to pretend. They were not afraid. The Mafia had put a price on him. Not a rumor price, not a drunk man's story. A real price with real money behind it, the kind of money that could turn a nobody into a somebody overnight. $50,000, enough to buy a house in a place where the sidewalks were not crowded with history. Enough to buy a fresh name, enough to make a desperate man believe he could shoot his way into a clean life. Bumpy heard it the way he heard everything, without drama. It came to him in a sentence that was not even finished. A friend leaning close in a diner booth, voice lowered as a fork scraped a plate. A glance toward the window, toward the street, as if the street itself might be listening. Bumpy did not ask, "Who?" He did not ask, "When?" Not at first. He just nodded once, slow, like a man accepting the weather report. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver watch. It was not the kind of watch that made noise. It was smooth from years of handling. The face had a thin crack through the glass, like a scar that had healed wrong. When he opened it, the small hands moved with patient certainty. Tick, tick, tick. He did not check the time the way nervous men check the time. He checked it the way a man checks his own pulse. Then he closed it and slid it back into his coat like it belonged there more than money ever could. The watch had a story. Most things around Bumpy did. Some said it had belonged to his father. Some said it was a gift from an old Harlem doctor who had seen Bumpy pay a man's hospital bill without letting anyone clap for him. Bumpy never explained it. He did not have to. The men who sat with him noticed it anyway, the way they noticed the steadiness in his eyes. In Harlem, a watch like that was not just a timepiece. It was a reminder that time belonged to someone, and it was not always the men with the loudest voices. The Mafia believed Harlem could be treated like a business ledger. They believed if they put enough money on the line, the right person would pick it up. They misunderstood Harlem's pride. They misunderstood Harlem's memory. They also misunderstood Bumpy Johnson. They thought he was a street man who had dressed himself in poetry. They thought he was a local king who could be removed like a bad tenant. They saw territory. They saw numbers. They did not see the web. They did not see the eyes in the barber shops, the whispers in the jazz rooms, the steady attention of the women who stood at windows and saw more than any man with a gun. Bumpy did not lecture about loyalty. He practiced it. He knew who needed money for rent. He knew which father had not come home from the docks. He knew which kid was getting pushed around at school. He also knew who was greedy enough to be tempted. When a bounty goes up, the streets do not only fill with killers. They fill with talkers too. People who want credit for knowing something. People who want to be the first to say they were close to the danger. Those people are useful if you let them be. Bumpy let them be, and he watched. On Lenox Avenue, men leaned against brick walls and pretended they were just enjoying a cigarette. In diners, spoons stopped halfway to mouths when certain names were spoken. In the back of a jazz room, a sax player kept playing while his eyes kept drifting to the door. It was not panic. It was a quiet tightening, like the city itself was holding its breath. The kind of breath you hold when you know a fight is coming, and you do not know who will bleed, but you know you will remember it. The human part of it lived in small places. A waitress named Ruth, who worked the lunch shift and the late coffee shift, started noticing which men sat without eating. She noticed which men ordered food and did not touch it. She noticed a new face on a corner that usually belonged to the same two old-timers who argued about baseball. Ruth had a son, and her son had shoes with holes in the soles. She had seen men killed for less than $50,000. She did not want her boy growing up in a world where strangers could buy death like it was a newspaper. So she watched and she remembered, and she spoke to the right person without making a show of it. That is what the Mafia did not understand. In their world, information traveled up chains, and power sat at the top. In Harlem, information moved sideways, through kitchens and stoops and church steps. The church mothers who looked harmless were often the sharpest. They knew who was sleeping where. They knew which new man did not belong. A woman can carry a warning in her tone like she is carrying groceries. No one suspects it until it is too late. The first mistake the shooter made was thinking he could be invisible. He came in clean. Too clean. A man can be poor and still keep himself neat, but there is a difference between neat and new. His coat had not learned the shape of his shoulders yet. His shoes did not have Harlem dust ground into them. He stood on a corner and did not lean like he belonged there. He watched too hard, like his eyes were doing labor. Harlem noticed him the way a body notices a splinter. The second mistake he made was asking the wrong question. He stepped into a small barber shop where the radio played low and the smell of hair tonic sat heavy in the air. He did not come out and say the name. He tried to be clever. He asked about the man who runs things up here. The barber did not stop cutting. His hands kept moving, steady, scissors snipping, but his eyes shifted just enough to measure the stranger's face. Harlem men had learned long ago that clever questions are often the most dangerous. By the time the shooter realized the neighborhood had weighed him, he had already been marked. Not marked with violence, marked with attention. Bumpy did not send boys to rough him up. That was the kind of chaos he avoided. He let the stranger walk. He let him feel confident. Confidence makes men careless. Careless men reveal themselves. Bumpy changed his own patterns without acting like he was changing them. He stopped visiting one jazz room and started visiting another. He walked one block longer before turning. He sat in a different booth at the diner, closer to the wall. He did not hide. Hiding tells people you are afraid. He simply moved like a man who owned his time. The cracked silver watch stayed in his pocket, and when he took it out, it was never in a hurry. Tick, tick, tick. A reminder that patience can be a weapon. The Mafia had sent a shooter, but they had not sent someone who understood Harlem's manners. The shooter waited for the kind of moment he had been trained to look for. A quick step into a doorway, A brief walk between a car and a curb, a shadowed hallway. He thought it was going to be simple. Find the man. Approach. Do what needs doing. Leave. That is how it worked in places where people did not know each other, where a man could disappear into a crowd. That did not care who he was. Harlem cared. Even the laughing kids on the block cared, and they did not even know they did. A little boy bouncing a rubber ball against a wall could tell you how many times a stranger walked past before he realized someone was counting. Kids will watch the same corner for hours because they have nowhere else to be. They will notice a tie that does not match the neighborhood. They will notice a man who keeps checking over his shoulder. They will notice a car that is parked too long with a driver who does not get out. That tie was the shooter's third mistake. It was dark, expensive, the knot too perfect. He had come dressed for a photograph, not for a block where men wore their lives on their sleeves. When he stepped into a diner to warm up, the tie drew eyes like a bright coin on a dirty floor. Ruth served him coffee. She did not smile too much. She did not frown. She just did her job. But she noticed how his hands held the cup. She noticed he did not eat. She noticed he watched the door as if he expected someone to enter who would change his whole world. When he asked for a match, his voice was polite, almost gentle, like he wanted to seem harmless. Ruth gave him the matchbook, and she watched his fingers take it as if she was watching him take a life. When Bumpy got the word, he did not call a meeting with shouting and threats. He did not gather men in a circle like a general. He did something quieter. He invited a few trusted people to eat, not because he needed food, because a table tells you who a man is. A man can lie with words, but he cannot lie with habits. At a table, you see who reaches first, who waits, who talks too much, who listens. They sat in a back room that smelled like fried onions and coffee. The city outside made its own music through the windows. Distant horns, footsteps, a laugh that cut off too fast. Bumpy sat with his coat still on, not because he was cold, but because it reminded everyone he was ready to stand up at any time. On the table, there was a plate of food that he did not touch. He let it sit there, steaming, like an offering left for someone who might never arrive. When the talk reached the point where most men would start making promises, Bumpy reached into his pocket and put a razor on the table. He did not snap it open. He did not wave it. He placed it down gently, like a man setting down a pen. The room went still. The razor was not a threat. It was a punctuation mark. It said, without words, that things were sharp now, and everyone needed to be careful. Then he lit a cigarette. The flame briefly warmed his face, and in that small light his eyes looked older than they were. He took one drag, slow, and let the smoke drift upward like a question. No one spoke over that smoke. No one dared. That was the iconic part of him people remembered later, the thing they would retell in whispers. The way he chose calm when the whole room wanted violence, the way he let silence do the work that shouting could not. "He is not here for Harlem," Bumpy said, voice quiet. "He is here for a number." That line changed the room. It took the fear and turned it into clarity. A man hunting you for a reason can be negotiated with. A man hunting you for a number is a different creature. Numbers do not have pity. Numbers do not have loyalty. Numbers do not have a neighborhood. Bumpy did not send anyone to kill the shooter. He did not need that kind of headline. He needed the Mafia to understand they were dealing with a man who could not be bought and could not be frightened into a mistake. So he planned something that would not spill blood in the street, something that would not make Harlem mothers pull their children inside and lock the door. He planned to make the shooter fail in a way that would embarrass the people who hired him. He let the shooter get close enough to feel he had a chance. That is a dangerous thing to do, because closeness is where bullets live. But Bumpy had a gift for reading men. He understood hunger. He understood desperation. He understood that a man who had come for $50,000 would want proof he was about to win before he pulled the trigger. Most killers, the ones who do not belong to a neighborhood, want to see the fear in the eyes of the person they are taking. It makes them feel powerful. It makes them feel like the money is already in their pocket. So Bumpy gave him a look to chase. A message moved quietly, not through one mouth, but through many. A little change in Bumpy's routine, allowed to be noticed. A hint dropped in the right place. A whisper that he would be at a certain jazz room, then later at a certain diner. The shooter followed the scent like a dog. He did not know he was being led. That night the jazz room was thick with cigarette smoke and sweat and perfume. A piano carried the room, its notes stepping carefully, as if it knew the floor was crowded with history. Men laughed too loudly to hide what they were thinking. Women watched, not with fear, but with calculation. In Harlem, even pleasure had a sharp edge. Bumpy arrived without a crowd. He did not need one. He greeted people with small nods, a hand on a shoulder, a word spoken close enough to be private. He sat where he always sat, but not exactly. An inch different. A slight angle. A man like him could change a whole situation with an inch. The shooter came in late, and that was mistake number 4. Late meant he had been waiting outside too long. Too long meant someone had had time to notice him. He moved like a man who had practiced walking into rooms with death in his pocket. He did not look at the band. He did not look at the women. His eyes searched for one thing. When he spotted Bumpy, his mouth tightened in satisfaction, the way a man tightens his grip on a prize. Bumpy did not look back right away. He let the shooter stand there with his confidence. He let the man feel taller than he was. Then, slowly, Bumpy reached into his coat and pulled out the cracked silver watch. He opened it and looked down at it as if the room had disappeared. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was not loud, but in that moment it felt like the room could hear it anyway. He closed it, placed it on the table beside his untouched drink, and finally lifted his eyes. Not to the shooter, to the shooter's hands. That is where a man's truth lives. In his hands. Hands that fidget. Hands that stay too still. Hands that reach for a pocket at the wrong time. Bumpy stood up without hurry. He took one step, then another, moving toward the back door as if he had decided he wanted fresh air. The shooter followed, careful not to be obvious, believing he was hunting the perfect moment. In the narrow hallway behind the room, the music became muffled, like a heart behind ribs. The walls were close. The air smelled like old smoke and damp coats. The shooter's breath shortened. He reached into his pocket. And that was the mistake. That ended his night, because the pocket he reached into was not the pocket Harlem men reached into when they wanted a match or a coin. It was the pocket of a man reaching for a weapon. And the person who saw it first was not Bumpy. It was a janitor, an old man with a mop and tired eyes who had been working that hallway for years. He had watched Harlem boys grow into Harlem men. He had watched fights begin over nothing and end over pride. He had watched police come late. He had watched mothers cry into their hands. When he saw that reach, his body moved before his mind did. Not with courage, with instinct. The mop handle slid forward, not striking, not attacking, simply blocking the shooter's path for half a second. Half a second is sometimes the whole world. In that small interruption, the shooter's confidence cracked. His eyes flicked away. His shoulders tensed. He tried to step around, and in that movement he revealed himself fully. The gun was there. The intention was there. The number in his head was there. Bumpy turned then, calmly, like he had been waiting for that exact moment to be confirmed. He did not lunge. He did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the shooter with something worse than anger. He looked at him with disappointment. "You came all the way here," Bumpy said, voice low, "and you still do not know where you are." The shooter froze because that line did not sound like fear. It sounded like a verdict. In that pause, two men appeared in the hallway behind Bumpy, not rushing, not frantic, just present. The shooter understood then that he had been walking inside a net the whole time. He had mistaken quiet for weakness. He had mistaken Harlem's calm eyes for blindness. He had mistaken Bumpy's patience for ignorance. The gun did not fire. There was no wild struggle, no bodies crashing, no glory. The shooter's arm lowered slowly, not because he had become good, but because he had become aware. Aware that shooting in that hallway would not buy him a clean escape. It would buy him a quick death, and not the kind that makes legends, the kind that makes statistics. They took the weapon without breaking bones. They moved him out a side door into an alley where the winter air cut sharp. The city did not cheer. The city kept breathing. A jazz note floated out from the room again, and inside, people kept sipping their drinks, pretending they were not listening to the danger being carried away. Bumpy walked back into the room and sat down as if he had only stepped out to check the street. The cracked watch was still on the table. He picked it up, opened it, looked at it for a beat, then closed it and put it back in his pocket. Time was still his. The consequence came later, the way consequences often do, not in blood, but in message. A whisper traveled back downtown, into rooms where men wore suits and believed they owned every street that paid them. The message was simple. The shooter failed, not because he was weak, but because Harlem was not a place you could purchase like a package, because Bumpy Johnson did not fight like a corner man. He fought like a mind. He fought like a community. He fought like a man who understood that respect is a currency more dangerous than money. The Mafia's $50,000 did not disappear. Money like that does not vanish, but it lost its teeth. It became a number that made men nervous rather than brave. A bounty is supposed to make people greedy. This one made them cautious, because everyone heard the same detail, repeated in slightly different ways, the way legends grow. The shooter reached, and something small stopped him. A mop handle, a half-second, a calm line that turned the hallway cold. And the part people loved most was that Bumpy did not have to raise his voice to win. Ruth the waitress went home that night and watched her son sleep. His shoes were still by the door, holes still in the soles. Outside, Harlem was still. Harlem. Not safe, not clean, but held together by something that did not exist in the Mafia's math. She thought about how close death had come and how quietly it had been pushed back. She did not pray for Bumpy like a saint. She prayed for the neighborhood, for the way a neighborhood has to stay awake when the world wants it asleep. In the days that followed, Bumpy moved through Harlem like a man who had simply handled business. He stopped to speak to an old woman on a stoop. He gave a kid a look that told him to go home before the street taught him something ugly. He sat in a diner and pushed aside a plate of food without touching it, listening to the room rather than eating. Men who had been tempted by the money kept their mouths shut, not because they had suddenly become loyal, but because they had learned something about survival. In Harlem, you can be greedy. You cannot be careless. That is how control returned. Not with a parade, not with gunfire, with quiet order, with a lesson delivered in the language Harlem understood best. Composure, intelligence, memory. A neighborhood deciding, again, who belonged and who did not. The Mafia could write a number on a piece of paper, but they could not write themselves into Harlem's story without paying a cost they did not understand. Years later, you could still hear people talk about it in places where stories live. In a barber shop when the radio went quiet between songs. In a jazz room when the band took a break and the smoke hung in the air like a curtain. On cold sidewalks where footsteps sounded like fate. They would say the Mafia tried to buy Bumpy's death, and the shooter made one mistake. Some said it was the tie. Some said it was the question. Some said it was the reach. But the ones who really knew, the ones who watched Harlem like Ruth watched it, would tell you it was something deeper. The mistake was thinking Bumpy Johnson stood alone. Because a legend is not just a man. A legend is a neighborhood deciding to remember him a certain way. History books will give you dates and names and neat endings. Harlem does not do neat endings. Harlem remembers the cracked watch in a calm man's pocket. Harlem remembers the way a razor can sit on a table without opening. Harlem remembers the way silence can pull the air out of a room. And Harlem remembers that when money tried to speak louder than respect, it was respect that people listened to. So when you hear that number, $50,000, and you imagine the kind of fear it is supposed to buy, ask yourself something quieter and harder. What is a man worth when a whole neighborhood decides he cannot be purchased? If you want more whispered Harlem legends, told the way the streets remember them, subscribe and stay close.